Our speaker today is Bob Freeman. I've known Bob for many years and have enjoyed our relationship together. He is a faculty member in the Department of Church History and Doctrine and currently serves as the Associate Dean. Chair, sorry. You don't want to go that high yet? No, okay. He is also director of the Saints at War Project, which he and his colleague, Dr. Dennis Wright, began back in the year 2000. This project has generated several thousand accounts of LDS veterans and has resulted in 6 book works as well as several documentaries. The newest volume, Inspiring Stories of Saints at War, is due out this spring. Sometimes accused by his colleagues of being a war addict because of his focus on his research, Bob disagrees, but does acknowledge that his research has gone deeper and taken him longer than he ever thought it would. Brother Freeman is currently involved in research on World War I and is working on a volume that is meant to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the Great War. Bob and his wife, Janelle, who is here with some of their children, live in Springville, and all total, they have 7 wonderful children and 1 very spoiled grandson. And they are diehard Cougar fans. So we welcome Dr. Bob Freeman to this podium to give us a lecture on the Civil War and LDS saints involved in that. So, Dr. Freeman, welcome.
Well, the first test has been passed. Russ could have said a whole lot of things. He's got the dirt on me, but he was kind and stuck to the script, and I am grateful. So thank you, Russ. You are a good friend, and we have enjoyed a good and long association. There are others here today who it would really be fun to take time to acknowledge because of the influence you've had on my career and life here at BYU. I will forego that opportunity, worrying that I might neglect to mention someone or ones. But I do want to thank in a particular way 2 groups. First, my family. It took only the slightest of incentives, namely dinner out after this lecture, to get them here. And my students who are here for very altruistic reasons, but won't mind very much if we offer just a little extra credit for their attendance. So thank you as well. And others from the library, and I see several, I should also include because over the decade now and longer that the Saints at War Project has been around, you have really been our ardent supporters, and without the talent and the time, expertise and friendship of those associated with the Lee Library and with Special Collections, L. Tom Perry Special Collections in particular, well, we wouldn't have had very much success at all. So we want to say just a couple of things introductory to the lecture focus that I have today about the ongoing research here at BYU. And so forgive me, unabashed plug here. The Saints at War Project commenced back in 2000 and has become one of the larger oral history and research projects of its kind really in America. And again, not only the library, Ken Alford is here and has been a wonderful associate. I wanted to mention in a moment the book that he recently drove home to the finish line. It's published on Civil War saints. But we continue that research, and we really want to gather more as we go forward in time, but have particular areas of emphasis that I want to mention in passing. As Russ said in the introduction, we are on the path right now of World War I and wanting to acquire any more accounts we can of the Great War. So if any present might have a relative way back when, perhaps someone in your ward or another association that would produce a voice of the distant past from World War I, how grateful we would be to learn of that individual, and likewise of the Civil War. So this is something that's an ongoing passion we have. As I say, because some present to date might not have a lot of background on the Civil War, I thought it might be worthy of just a quick mention. Why are we so big on the Civil War right now? And there are several very good reasons for that, one of which is that this is the time of the 150th commemoration or anniversary of the Civil War. And, well, out west, we are trying to do our part. Back east, this is really, really big, as Ken will tell you, and others that might have associations back east. The recent film Lincoln is a good evidence that it is on our minds. I want to just quickly show and tell Ken's good work, the Civil War Saints we produced here on campus through the Religious Studies Center. And it has been a great contribution. I think this week's Daily Universe edition carries mention of a local play at the Hale Theater that is, again, dedicated to that focus. So lots of ways to get attention for a very, very important chapter of America's past. And then, as Russ mentioned, the exhibit here at BYU, which I have visited several times, and I'm so pleased today to have my children taking a look at it as well, and thank those who are dedicated to bringing that exhibit about. So be sure to stop and see it on your way out today if you possibly can. Well, the story of Latter-day Saints in the Civil War. Brother Alford has presented a lecture. I think yours was in February. Is that right, Ken? And then our esteemed colleague Dick Bennett, Richard Bennett, Dr. Bennett presented earlier this month. And I don't know, Russ, have we got any more in the series planned for this spring? Maybe one more. So if you've been able to make others of the series, first, apologies. You're probably getting the more humble of the qualified, the least qualified of the presenters here today. But we've got some really important aspects of the war we're trying to pick up on. And I've received the opportunity to talk about the people. And that's right where I like to be, because it is their stories of suffering, of sacrifice, sometimes of great valor, of privations that really touches me in a way that I have found a constant interest in that facet of the story of the Civil War. A couple of just broad stroke facts, if we can, just to bring to our attention of the war in a general way. Frankly, the Civil War is a war that has no peer in terms of military conflicts of the latter days. Perhaps you've heard the statistical summary that when taken and compared to World War I, II, the Vietnam War, let me see, I went through this yesterday again so that I wouldn't hesitate. Korean War, Vietnam War, it eclipses those wars combined in terms of American deaths. And so it just really does loom large on the historical landscape. Reminding ourselves of the dates of the war, that it commenced in April of 1861, and some of you familiar with the famous shots fired at Fort Sumter, and then concluded in the summer of 1865, first with the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Then there were several ensuing surrenders, and that's a story in and of itself and for another day that wrapped up the war. Abraham Lincoln, who, again, the subject of the recent really large and famous movie, was President of the United States throughout the duration of the conflict, and Jefferson Davis of the South. Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee, these are generals, names of generals that also are pretty well household names even today. Just a quick snapshot of the violence of the war. That the Civil War is certainly one of those that stands in a giant way in looking back at the horrific cost of conflict. And any of you who've been to Civil War sites have seen cemeteries that have been maintained throughout the decades since, it still is a very, very important part of remembering the Civil War. I want to talk for a moment just about the Utah War, which I'm saying in this slide sets us kind of a prelude for the Civil War. I wish we could talk in a little bit more detail, but for this short few minutes we have together, I'll just say when you look at it, some call it the war that wasn't, because really it's not about violence, and it wasn't about shots going back and forth, but in essence, it's a future training ground for the Civil War. And I think the statistic that's most interesting to me is that it was during the Utah War, or expedition as it's been called, that about 60 future generals of the Civil War really got their boot camp, really got their experience and training. And again, the very interesting thing to me is that how it divides. That 30 of those generals were Union and 29 were Confederates is just so insightful to me about the true nature of the conflict and how just divided this nation was. And I might say, as an extension of that, if you are up at all on the Utah War, you know that while it wasn't known originally at the time of the events as the invasion of Johnston's army, that's sort of how we've come to know it over the years. And it's ironic that Johnston himself becomes sort of a poster general for how things go wrong in the future, because he in fact goes south after leading the effort to keep the Saints from turning against the Union. He in fact turns against the Union, ultimately dies at Shiloh, and is regarded as one of the most influential generals of the Confederacy, as Jefferson Davis evaluates later. His death really was a turning point for the South and its ultimate demise. So just very interesting to think about that. Now, I've mentioned my friend Brother Alford a couple of times already this hour, and I just want to say, when he spoke last month, I think this is right, Ken, maybe on the order of 385-ish Latter-day Saints have been identified who had involvement in the Civil War. But a good number of those, or a statistically significant number of those, really come into the church after 1865, after the war. And so our focus here today will just be on illuminating a little bit on several lives of those who were bona fide Latter-day Saints at the time of their involvement in the conflict. We do, however, have saints on both sides of the fray. We have individuals involved in the fighting, while most are going to remain out west. Now, I thought, as just a personal touch, if you will, I just mentioned my own experience in coming to the experience of the Civil War, or the history of the Civil War. A number of years ago, maybe 7 or 8, I had the good fortune of visiting Gettysburg. And I was under the tutelage of a good friend and military historian by the name of Sherman Fleek. He gave me what he called the term the $500 tour. Gratefully, he waived the fee. In any case, he really took us the route of all of the different movements of those several days at Gettysburg, in one of the most notable battles of the war. And it occurred to me, both just before, during, and then after the experience of being with him, that I had an ancestor who had been at Gettysburg. I knew that somewhere, in some setting of family that had been mentioned. And I knew that out of this experience, which was very impactful on me, I ought to give a little more attention to that individual, find out a little more about who he was. You see his name here at the bottom and right, Alpheus Williams. I did not know at the time that he was a general, had been there at Gettysburg, and that his involvement was important. And I learned, upon asking around with family and just my own research, that he had written very consistently letters to his daughters back home. He was from Michigan. And lo and behold, those letters taken collectively had been published in a bookwork, in a volume. And of course, now I have to get a hold of the book, and I do, and I learned through that book and through the opportunity to review those letters of his very powerful experience during not only Gettysburg, but throughout his time and involvement in the Civil War. And it certainly was for me a time of turning the hearts of the children to their fathers. And I will forever be grateful for that experience and coming to have a connection to the experience personally. And I would challenge any of you, not only with regard to the Civil War, which is our subject here today, but any military conflict that you might have a connection to. If you haven't yet, and I speak with special attention and focus on the young present, if you haven't yet seized that opportunity to find what that connection is and to learn more about it as opportunity presents, do it. Will you just take that challenge? It may be the only takeaway you'd have today, but find that opportunity, do a little family history, ask around, and see if you can't learn more. All right, well, we pivot. Now we'll give the attention we should. By the way, I just have to say this. I was assured by Lisa they would really appreciate it if I stay put and not leave the podium because we are recording. But I did bring just a couple of visual aids, my modest attempt at a little bit of a Relief Society look here. And so for those in the back, I have here, and Val, you're so good at these things, I should have you up closer. You could say some things, but just a little splash of the red, white, and blue. And then in front, and really the thing that I'm able to say something about is I've got a 12-pound cannonball, which I invite any of you who would like after the lecture to come up and just heft, and so you can say, about what the feel of one of those cannonballs is. And the interesting thing about it is I'm left to wonder, and we are all, where does a ball like this come from? I don't know the answer. That's the fun of it, except that it was found by a farmer north of Utah Lake. And I've had a military historian who has come, looked at it, and judged that it would have dated back to the time of the Utah conflict and of Johnston's army. And so that dates it, at least as old as the Civil War, okay? So that's the reason I'm using it as an object lesson today, and it at least gives me some sense of time frame with an object. All right, well, having said that, you've had a chance probably to view this slide and read through it on your own. I'll just say in sort of a nod and a wave, probably the largest contingent of Latter-day Saints that we could give attention to today, in fact, clearly the largest contingent of Latter-day Saints in the Civil War we could give attention to today, were those that served with Robert Burton and with Lot Smith's companies. They were a volunteer company. They were invited into service for a very short term. Lot Smith's company is bona fide enough, if you will, as soldiers that they would have qualified for a veteran's pension after the war. Robert Burton's not so, but both of them deserve, again, a tip of the cap, but it's not our intent here today to give individual attention to those who serve. But that's probably the thing you hear first as we talk about, well, who were the Latter-day Saints that were any way, shape, or form involved during the Civil War. But now we turn our attention to individual soldiers. And these are just a few examples of those that I might have summoned, and I've chosen them because they represent some different aspects of service. And I start really with one of those that is nearest to my heart at the beginning. And Val, I think we said before, we would touch on Henry Wells Jackson. And turns out, in our research at least, as we've been able to identify, he may be the first American Latter-day Saint to have perished in a national conflict, okay? So we got to have kind of be careful how we say that, because it looks like we may have a Brit, a Latter-day Saint who did perish in the Crimean War. But if we look to the American landscape, Henry makes a pretty good candidate to be that first statistic of having perished in a national conflict. He was born in New York, and we'll see here in a few moments that a couple of those that we're going to take a quick survey of were actually born were not born on American soil. So he's born in New York and baptized in Nauvoo. He's a young man and musician in the Mormon Battalion. So we're looking back to 1846, 47. Along the way, he marries the daughter of one of the influential early personalities in Mormondom, Philo Dibble. Her name, Eliza Ann. By the way, Philo is buried down in Springville, where I live. So we're getting out here to Utah. He works for a time for the mail route. It turns sort of belly up, and he isn't getting his pay. He's assured that if he really wants to secure payment, he needs to go back east. And so he's going to go back to Washington, D.C., his apparent purpose only to secure payment for services rendered. And along the way, he hires out for the Union forces. He sees an opportunity for coming back with just a little more than he thought he might. But unfortunately, he was captured, taken as a prisoner of war, where he spent several months in prison camps. By the way, very often during the Civil War, being incarcerated was tantamount to having a death sentence passed on you because so many died in these camps. And a couple sort of loom large in that number, but we won't detail that. Andersonville, I guess, be one that could certainly come to mind. I think I've seen statistic that of the Confederate casualties, about 30,000 of those that died during their incarcerations. And again, Union soldiers as well. It was very, very difficult. So he lasts about 3 months there, is finally liberated, and then joins the army, feeling like this will be my opportunity to at least be with associates who can protect me a little bit. And so he does. And but sadly, at Jarrett Station in Virginia, and on May 8th, 1864, he is severely wounded. And then it would be just a couple of weeks later that he passed away at Chesapeake General Hospital. And I think we showed his headstone just a moment ago. He was buried and at the cemetery just there in Virginia. So he never did make it back west. So he is our first, and certainly deserves a mention here today. All right, the next we turn to is David Peary. And David Peary is a Confederate soldier, and so we're kind of going to look on the other side, who has fascinated me over the time of my research, because his is a experience of actually joining the church during the conflict, but in a very interesting way. Now, this slide, I've chosen to include a picture of a present-day hotel in Salt Lake City, which some of you perhaps have seen. It's called the Peary Hotel. It's named for David and continues to operate. I think it has like an Olive Garden or some restaurant there. No, it's not the Olive Garden. Anyway, it's a popular place. And, a year or two ago, I was kind of learning more about David Peary, and I thought about this hotel named in his honor, and I thought, I ought to go and see how they've remembered David. And so I went inside, and there was a beautifully framed picture of David Peary, and kind of between candlesticks and over a beautiful table, and hanging on the wall there in the lobby. And I went up and I asked just one of the desk clerks, I see this lovely picture you have here. Do you know who it is of? And they confessed they did not. And so I asked for the manager. I says, do you know who this individual is? He did not. And so, we're kind of chasing up the line here. And finally somebody thought maybe that was, something about the originator of the hotel, and, got the name David Peary. And so they kind of remember him, but maybe time has also allowed us to forget a little bit too. In his case, he was born in Virginia. You may know Virginia, one of the first nations to declare, or one of the first states, to declare a secession from the Union. he marries in his early adult life. I guess he was a very handsome guy, and I should say this. He was very bright. There's some things described in his personal account about that. But he along the way, as he enters adulthood, meets the daughter of a Mormon family named Nancy. And Higginbotham, her last name. He marries Nancy, loves everything about this beautiful young woman except her religion. And that he just really detests. And he eventually invites not one but two itinerant preachers to come to their home, try to dissuade her from her faith. And you love stories like this. I love stories like this, that she in fact bests them, I guess we would say, and they leave discouraged that Nancy is not going to turn from the faith of her fathers. So she continues resolute, and that's the way they peacefully coexist until the outbreak of the war nearly a decade later in 1861. All right, well, you see the statistics here. In the early months of the war, and through that terrible thing, typhoid fever, he loses his parents, actually out of order here, I think a child. Then his wife, Nancy, succumbs to the fever. And now he is brokenhearted. In the end, he also will contract the fever, but recover. He's back home convalescing and just really feeling the discouragement that we can only imagine, having been deprived of so much of his family, when he begins to take a closer look at the religion that his wife loved. And that led him to a search not only of the Book of Mormon, but other, I think there was a pamphlet, one of Parley B. Pratt's pamphlets, Voices, was in the list of things he was able to just discover and read and ponder. And he knew it was true. His search continued. He ultimately travels 25 miles to the closest Mormon elders, where he is baptized, and now his newfound faith returns back home. As is described in the bullet points, he returns to service in the Army, and in 1862, and then contracts typhoid fever the second time. Along the way, his home has been just on a main path of the Union and Confederate forces. Back and forth they go. So much of it is destroyed. And ultimately, in 1864, he, along with primarily his in-laws, including his wife's sister, began to make plans to travel west to be with the saints. And this they will do. And they arrive in 1865. Ultimately, as you can see, he marries his wife's sister, and they have 10 children together. So, very prolific family. He serves a mission later in life in the southern states, is a stake president for a time. I was just reading this morning again Brigham Young's announcement at a stake conference that he would be the stake president. He said, David's not a terribly religious man. He doesn't give long prayers, but he will lead you well. So what an introduction to becoming a stake president that would be. John, you're there, you know. Okay. And for a time, he serves as mayor of Ogden, and then ultimately also was elected to the territorial legislature. All right, want to talk for a moment about William Rex. And he's an important figure in our list of Civil War saints because he's an example of an individual who served in the war. Russ, what time is it, by the way? About 30 after? Thank you. I thought about 30 after. And Janelle, maybe you can give me a 5-minute watch there at the time of maybe 2:40. Sorry, students. I just promised my students we would be out on time. Isn't that right? Okay, so William Rex. His family joins the church in England and make their way to America, their first home to be in the St. Louis area. And that's all well and good until his father passes away shortly after their arrival. And now with his widowed mother, along with his widowed mother, he and one or two other siblings are left to fend for themselves. He talks in his journal about actually swimming out into the Mississippi River to salvage wood that is drifting by. I've wondered at that, what that would have been, the giant, mighty Mississippi. And that wood would be salvaged and then sold to the locals as firewood and maybe building materials and such. So that was one of the things he did to try to help in sustaining the family. At age 17, he leaves and is on his own, and now is going to need support. He enlists in the Union Army. I want to say at this juncture, his experience coming from another land than the United States and being in the war was not so unusual. I've seen statistics that have upwards of a third or maybe even more of some of the units being made up of immigrant individuals who have come and who need to secure employment, and this is a way that they can do that, and so they do. So here he is, very young. His first attempt, by the way, at joining the Union Army, his mother caught on to him and called him back home. So he had to wait just a little longer to re-enlist. But he does. He serves for just a year and a half or so, and then after the war is, of course, discharged. This is actually the official discharge papers. Carries the signature of Abraham Lincoln. I know where the original of this is, but I don't know if President Lincoln would have signed very many of those papers, so I just don't know how they did that. But anyway, he, for family, for his posterity, has been quite a source of pride to have those papers and have them framed and in their front room. After the war, he marries Elizabeth, and they have 13 children. I'm just kind of rest of storying here for a moment to say, like David Peary, who we were just visiting about, he later serves a mission, in his case, back to his homeland of England, and is a part of establishing the community of Randolph. And if you know where Randolph is, it's a very cold place in the winter, but a wonderful corner in Zion. And so he does really good things. And I want to say, as a tribute to his family name, one of his posterity was a man by the name of Elder Monty Bruff, and anyone knows that name, a general authority who made a lot of great contributions to the church. So one measure at least of the value and legacy of the William Rex and Bruff line. All right, we go next to John Davis Evans, and I chose him because he's just kind of fun, because in the recent years, it's been not unusual for one of the floats, not the floats, but one of those things that shows up in the Days of 47 parade in Salt Lake to be the John Davis Evans Union Ice Cream Truck. And it's drawn, it's a horse-drawn, not carriage, I suppose, but wagon that is just there, and you can see the Union attire of the soldier on horseback to your right of the wagon, and the family again very proud, justly proud of their early ancestor, and he is the subject of the book Silencing the Vicksburg Guns. He was just a private, but again involved in the conflict in a battle experience. In his case, like Brother William Rex, he was born on foreign soil, in his case, Wales. He comes with his family to America in 1850, and they also settle in St. Louis, which was one of the great byways, of course, of coming west. He twice is involved in ferrying saints to the west and goes back and then brings another company out. And ultimately, it's while living in Utah that on learning of the outbreak of the Civil War, he determines he needs to be there. While he may have been born on foreign soil, his memories are only of being an American. And as far as I can detect, he is truly joining up for what we might term patriotic purposes, which is worthy of a mention because there aren't very many instances in our military heritage up to that time where Latter-day Saints are doing doing that, where they are joining the military experience because of that as a primary purpose. We would look to the Mormon Battalion experience and say a lot of that had to do with helping to fund the movement of the saints west. And we could get into some of this and look at other experiences, but this is unusual, especially in light of the fact that for the most of the saints, we're still feeling a little wounded for how the nation had treated us back east. So he joins up for very positive purposes, we would say. He's involved in the fighting, is wounded at Gettysburg, and has an extended hospital stay that then culminates in his eventual discharge. By the way, again, a little like illness, being wounded was a very difficult scenario in the day of the Civil War and conflicts of that era, just because medicine was so much in its infant stage as it related to battlefield administration. So he did survive it, though, returned back to Utah, where he marries, and as you can see indicated here, is father of 10 children, operates for almost 20 years this little ice cream company before succumbing in 1908. All right, we need a quick last one or two stories, one at least to include romance. John Rosa. I call him an unlikely convert. I mentioned earlier the Utah conflict being a prelude for the Civil War. And John Rosa was actually a part of the errand of Johnson's army. He came out, was stationed at Camp Floyd. Some of us will note that Camp Floyd is still today a place that we could visit. It is just north and west of Utah Lake, and it's maintained as a state park today. And so I'm looking at my students and others. This would be a great date idea. Go out and see Camp Floyd. By the way, Camp Floyd has to be renamed at the outbreak of the Civil War, and someone here will know that name. Anyone? Crittenden, yes. My middle name is Chittenden, and so I take great joy in having an unusual name like that show up in the history books. Well, why does it have to be renamed? Because Floyd goes to the south as well. Initially, it was named for Floyd, who was the Secretary of War? Yeah. And then he falls into disgrace, and we have to rename the camp. But it will look like Camp Floyd on any maps you'll need to get out to the camp today. In any case, he's there, and wouldn't you just know, he comes into the acquaintance of a wonderful young lady by the name of Patience Loader, and the two are fast friends. Yes, the rest of the story is that they will marry. And so I think of Women on the Home Front when I think of Patience, because she writes a fair amount about her experience. And I think our special collections has her account here. In fact, I know they do, of some of her pinings and her reflections during that time of her life. And it's a very challenging time. But the interesting thing is when the war breaks out, when John, along with all the rest of those stationed at Camp Floyd, moved back into the eastern country, she will attend her husband. She will go with him back out to the Washington, D.C. area, where she will actually take up employment as an army laundress, okay? And then ultimately she runs a boarding house and is just doing whatever it takes to make ends meet during this fray that initially is promised to be over in a mere few months. Some of you may know, familiar with the Civil War history, it was supposed to be this really short episode. Not so, like so many other conflicts. And in the end, oops, I thought I had one more slide here. In the end, she goes back out west, and John passes away, dies on his way to, after the war, to rejoin her. And so it's sort of a poignant rest of the story of sadness, but also of a great loyalty that they had for each other during the time that they were through the experience of the Civil War. Well, looking at time and remembering promises made, I will just pause here and say, learning of lives of those Civil War saints, though few in number, has deepened my appreciation for the service and sacrifice and valor of those who serve in whatever times of conflict. There are really three primary purposes. And I'm going to dash ahead one more time to give a last plug for the research here at BYU. There are really three purposes why we do what we do with regard to the various conflicts and the Latter-day Saints who have served in them. The first is to educate. And I hope we've done a little of that here today, talking about both the broad strokes of the war itself. And then we focus on individual lives. We come to understand more who these individuals were. And then, too, we try to pay tribute to those who have served. And you may know just several weeks ago, we had an experience here at BYU of doing that with regard to the service of one of our own who passed away in Afghanistan in the recent past in his service. And that, for me, is one of the reasons why we want to continue this research. And finally, in paying tribute, we also deepen our gratitude. And our gratitude not only for those who have served and the various conflicts which we are aware of in the last dispensation, but also gratitude for the freedom and for the values that we have today in large measure because of those sacrifices. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a part of that and look forward to continuing it. And again, implore any of you who might have contacts that we could learn of, whose lives and service might advantage us in our research, to do so. And thank you for the invitation to be here today.
So one man that you spoke of, I think his last name was Jackson.
Yes.
He got captured by the Confederates and then joined the Army. Was it the Union or Confederate Army that he joined?
Oh, good. He was captured by the Confederates, and then on his release, which I think was a part of a negotiated prisoner exchange, he joins the Union forces. And he did that to have protection, but of course in the end, he was a casualty anyway. So you might say, maybe he should have come west, right? But he stayed and did the hard thing. Anyone else?
It appeared as if one of those individuals had had some influence while they were stationed at Camp Floyd to join the church. Are there others? Anything in terms of influence that while being stationed here and going through that invasion process where we had influence on them, where they changed their lives?
Well, that is such a good question. I hope I can give at least a little bit of insight. When Camp Floyd was established, it was really a brokered resolution of the tensions that had really begun with the invasion of Johnston's army. Thomas L. Kane comes out west, and he's a part of trying to avoid the violence of war, is successful in getting this agreement that the army can come through Salt Lake and then become established 30 miles south in this place we know of today as Camp Floyd. Brigham Young had deep suspicions about all of this, of course, and admonished the saints really not to go around very much. However, there was the issue of commerce and opportunity, and so there was some opportunity for interchange, and I think that's really what gives us the eventual meeting and marriage of the Rosas. So I think initially there was a great hesitation from her parents. I call to memory some of the detail of her part of that account, but she moves forward anyway and loves him very much. Any last takers? I want to invite, if I may, any of my students who are here and wouldn't mind having extra credit for this lecture opportunity today, come on down. There's a form here you could sign on your way out. Otherwise, Russ, can I just hang around here for a few minutes? Any that would like to visit individually? Okay. Thanks again very much for coming on a Friday afternoon. Means a lot to me.